Luke Skywalker, destroyer of the Death Star, son of the Chosen One, savior of the galaxy, hero of the rebellion, Grand Master of the Jedi Order. He was all of these things and much more. Over an entire lifetime of fighting, adventuring, and non-stop growth, Luke Skywalker forged a path of destiny for himself that far exceeded the expectations of a simple farm boy or even the average Jedi Knight. In Star Wars Legends, Luke would survive all of the horrific things that he had to go through, and would retire with friends and family as a tired old man full of life. But what were the final days of Luke Skywalker really like? What was the last adventure among the stars? And what was the last thing that Luke Skywalker did? Before, of course, finally passing on through the Force. The ending of his story is one that we first had assumed happened at the end of the Fate of the Jedi series, Apocalypse. That was the final novel in the Abeloth saga. In the finale, Luke, along with Darth Krayt, would work together in order to achieve unity in the Force and defeat the wicked abomination of Abeloth. However, we recently learned that there was yet one more novel that explored the twilight of the Grand Master. This novel is simply titled Crucible. So friends and acolytes, join us today as we recall the greatest experience in Luke Skywalker's life, his final adventure, and his final discovery of the true nature of the Force itself. As far as we know for a while, the last thing Luke did as Grand Master was the order that he gave at the end of the Apocalypse novel. Once Abeloth had been defeated, Luke would recover from his injuries and hold a meeting with the Jedi Council and a government representative. It was here that we learned that the Jedi had been ordered off of Coruscant, as the Senate had decided to pin all of the devastation on the Jedi, blaming all of Abeloth's destruction solely on them. So while the Jedi were forced to relocate to the ancestral homeworld of Ossus, Luke would make an executive action towards their future. Luke knew that Abeloth was never truly gone. A being like her who existed within the Force couldn't be killed simply by destroying her physical forms. Luke knew deep down, and could practically sense, that Abeloth would one day return. It wouldn't be in his lifetime, perhaps not even in their children's lifetime. Luke speculated that it most likely wouldn't be for thousands of years. But rather than leave it to the future to deal with, Luke once again decided to take matters into his own hands and provide the ways towards destroying Abeloth once and for all. His decision: to locate the Dagger of Mortis. The dagger was the only thing that actually killed the Ones, and was likely the only thing that could destroy Abeloth considering her power's close relation to the Mortis gods. She may be invincible to most things, but the one tried and true weapon that is proven to kill an immortal was still out there. Of course, the issue was that the Mortis dagger was of course resting within the Mortis monolith, which was free floating in space itself. One of the Jedi sent on the case by Luke mentioned that even if they could triangulate an approximate location for the dagger, it would take them years to find it. Luke confirmed this, and was even comfortable accepting that it would likely take the rest of his life, and maybe even a couple of future generations, before they found the dagger. But that was their future's only hope of defeating the Bringer of Chaos, when she one day would inevitably return. There was no doubt in Luke's mind about this. Abeloth would return, and it was his duty to protect the galaxy. There was zero doubt left in the Grandmaster's mind. This order would be the last we heard of Luke for a little while, and we had originally speculated that he would spend the rest of his life passively seeking Mortis and would eventually pass away peacefully. But his story did not end here. Crucible, the final novel of the Legends EU before the Legacy era begins, tells the story of an adventure undertaken by the elderly trio of Han, Luke, and Leia. The book is mostly about them investigating some pirates and a conspiracy involving one of Lando's businesses. This leads to the discovery that two Kolomi brothers who went to Krathis and Marbred Kref had led a criminal enterprise for decades under the nose of Luke. We learned that they established their base in a place that they called the Chilun Rift, where they began to rob mining businesses. This is where they would get involved with Lando. Their own base happened to be built upon a mysterious monolith that was floating in the rift. It is heavily hinted at that this mysterious monolith is in fact the Mortis monolith. It required Force sensitives to open, and what lied within was a forested world that was heavily concentrated with Force energy. So much so that it actually gave the Kreth brothers powers. We'll skip over the majority of the story since the video is mostly focusing on the end of Luke, but we definitely recommend you check out this novel for yourselves if you'd like to get more on the narrative. But back to Luke, Han, and Leia. Anyway, the group pursued the brothers into the monolith, destroying the Force-sensitive clones that they had as bodyguards. Once inside the monolith, Luke and Leia battle the brothers who have now adopted the powers of the ones of Mortis. The battle was ultimately won by the Grand Master, but resulted in a huge explosion of power that drew Luke and Leia into the very realm of the Force itself, leaving Han all alone in the forest. It was here in limbo between life and death that Luke and Leia both assumed complete unity with the Force. They experienced a multiplicity of sensations that taught them the true nature of the Force. And this is what the novel goes on to say. Then, a searing agony washed over him as the wave of Force energy took him, two at once burning his body and healing it, devouring him and renewing him. Luke hung on to this last moment, caught between death and life, for an eternity. He was at the end of his life and at its beginning, drowning in agony and filled with bliss, and he began to see that this was the essential nature of the Force itself. The Force was life, and life was growth, and nothing grew that did not change, and change was destruction. That was why the dark side existed. Life bore death, death nourished life, destruction came before rejuvenation, and pain came before healing. The dark side was as necessary to life as the light side was. Without it, verdant worlds would stagnate, galactic empires would rule forever. Luke saw this all and more, saw that conflict was as necessary to progress as was harmony, that suffering was as essential to wisdom as was joy. Perhaps there was no pure good, no absolute evil. There was only life, only change and growth, suffering and joy, death and rebirth. There was only the Force. This is what Luke Skywalker did with his final days. It was from this experience at the very end of his life that he understood completely what the Force meant. Life and change. Many have tried to seek the understanding of true balance within the Force, whether that is the Jedi of the ancient days, the Grey Jedi of the Old Republic, and the Clone Wars, or those like Qui-Gon Jinn, who just tried to learn it by following its will. The Force is both the end and the beginning. Although Anakin was the chosen one, and ideally this was the kind of knowledge he should have attained in life, it would actually be his son who would learn the true ways of balance completely. We find this extremely interesting, and thematically on point for the Legends version of Luke Skywalker. Luke, who was essentially the chosen one's second chance. All things must eventually come to a conclusion, just like Luke Skywalker's journey, for it is the way of the Force. But do not worry, Luke wouldn't die here, not like this. It was Han who was left alone in what we assumed to be the world of Mortis, calling out desperately into the void for his wife Leia and his best friend. Through the ripples of the Force itself, Leia would hear the voice of her husband, and suddenly, although she had completely forgotten his name, forgotten the names of her enemies, her friends, even forgotten her own name, she remembered. Bringing her identity back into herself, she was able to pull herself out of the Force and come back to the world of the living. Once she manifested back with Han, she then called out Luke's name, and the same happened to him. Luke emerged back from the Force itself, enlightened now to its full understanding. In this moment, Luke was fulfilled and tired. He was ready to retire his role as the Grand Master. The real question remains, if this was the Mortis monolith, did Luke ever find the dagger? Well, Ben Skywalker would actually ask his father this very question. But what Luke said was that he truly did not know. Right before they left, he said that there was no sign that the ones were ever there in the first place, or that Anakin and Obi-Wan ever visited Mortis. He said that the Force was far too raw in that place, and that it didn't feel very in balance at all. In a very unfortunate, but understandable sequence of events, Luke would never know if that monolith was ever truly Mortis or something else. In the end, unfortunately, the monolith that they visited did not hold the Mortis dagger. 3 months later, our heroes would finish their story off by having drinks in a cantina surrounded by their friends and their family. Luke tells his son Ben that he plans to go away for a while, and thus ends the story of the Jedi, the hero, the legend, Luke Skywalker, as Luke Skywalker truly would ride into the sunset. The next time that we would encounter Luke would be as he appears to Cade Skywalker as a Force ghost, several generations of Skywalkers later. At the end of his battle-torn life, Luke had come to terms with the fact that the dark side and conflict were a necessary part of growth and life. He didn't regret his life of adventure or scorn the days of fighting. He embraced it all as part of the living Force, and lived out the rest of his days reaping the benefits of his long life. Luke defied all odds, and not only did not fall into the same trappings as Anakin, but redeemed his father, the Chosen One. He destroyed Lord Sidious's Sith, fought off the Yuzhong Vong, built up the Jedi, and in the face of all adversity, Luke Skywalker triumphed in the end. He would go toe-to-toe with otherworldly beings that far outclassed him in power, such as the spirit of Exar Kun, or even a dark goddess in Abeloth. Despite all of the tragedy in Luke's life, he was now at peace. None of this would ever haunt him. He achieved true and absolute balance within the Force, and for every moment that he lived and died, he was a true Jedi Knight. But my friends, I do hope that you enjoyed this video and got some personal closure on the story of Grand Master Luke Skywalker. As always, we want you to leave your feedback in the comments and tell us what other kind of stories you want to hear about concerning Luke and other lore in the Star Wars universe. But until the next holocron, we will leave you with the final words recorded of Luke when he made his final toast. To new journeys, and may the Force be with us all.